Welcome to your deep dive. Today we'll be tackling Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Sounds good.
And you're interested in actionable strategies, not just like a book summary.
Right.
So we're extracting the best tactics for building good habits and ditching bad ones.
Absolutely.
Now, have you ever felt like you need a complete overhaul to achieve your goals?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Well, Clear's own story is a great reminder that it's not about massive action, but consistent, tiny improvements.
Okay.
He went from a life-threatening injury as a high school athlete to becoming an academic All-American.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And what's remarkable is that he achieved this through consistent small improvements.
Yes.
It's the idea of compounding, much like compound interest.
I see.
So imagine setting a goal to read more. Instead of trying to devour a whole book in a day, what if you committed to just one page a day?
Yeah, that's much easier.
That seems manageable, right? Almost insignificant.
Right.
But imagine the impact of that one page a day over a year.
Yeah, you'd probably get through a couple books.
This leads us to another key idea from the book, the power of systems over goals.
That's interesting.
This comes from Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert.
Oh, yeah.
He argues that focusing on building the right system, the processes that lead to your desired outcomes, is much more effective than solely fixating on goals.
Okay, so what would that look like?
So instead of saying, I want to lose 10 pounds,
Yeah.
you'd focus on creating a system that supports that goal, like planning healthy meals each week or incorporating a daily walk into your routine.
Okay, that makes sense.
So could this system-focused approach be more sustainable for you in the long run?
It definitely seems less stressful.
Right. It takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
Now, to understand how to build these systems, we need to look at the science behind habits, and that's where the habit loop comes in.
Makes sense.
Right? Atomic Habits breaks down the habit loop into 4 stages: cue, craving, response, and reward.
Okay.
This neurological feedback loop is the engine behind every habit we have, good or bad. Let's take procrastination as an example, a challenge you mentioned wanting to tackle.
Uh-huh.
Can you think of a specific cue that often triggers your procrastination?
Well,
Is it a deadline? A feeling of overwhelm? A certain time of day?
yeah, I think it is.
What is it?
Certain times of day.
Really?
Yeah, like
What time of day?
the afternoon.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's a great question to consider.
Yeah.
Pinpointing that initial trigger can help us understand the craving behind the procrastination.
Yeah.
Is it the desire to avoid stress, the need for a break, or maybe even a fear of failure?
Yeah, maybe all of the above.
Once we identify the craving, we can start to interrupt the loop or redirect it towards a more desirable outcome.
So, how would you do that?
For instance, if the craving is to avoid stress, could you implement a system for breaking down tasks into smaller, more manageable steps?
Yeah, maybe.
That's a great tactic.
Okay.
It makes the task seem less daunting and reduces the urge to procrastinate.
Right.
And once you complete a step, you get a small reward. That feeling of accomplishment, which reinforces the positive loop.
Makes sense.
This leads us to another interesting point. Our environment plays a significant role in shaping our habits.
Our environment.
Atomic Habits uses the analogy of how the shapes of continents influence the spread of agriculture.
Oh, wow.
Just like those geographical features,
Oh,
our surroundings can either support or hinder our desired behaviors.
that's kind of wild.
It makes you think about all the subtle ways our environment influences us.
Uh-huh.
Clear suggests we're more likely to notice cues that stand out.
Oh.
So if we want to make a good habit stick, we need to make the cue obvious and readily available.
So, what would be an example of that?
Think about your workspace. If you're constantly bombarded with distractions, it's going to be much harder to focus on your work.
Yeah, that's definitely me.
But if you create a dedicated workspace that's clean, organized, and free from distractions, you're setting yourself up for success.
Okay.
So it's not just about willpower, it's about setting up your environment to support your goals.
Right. Would rearranging your workspace to minimize distractions be a small tweak you could implement?
Yeah, I could try that.
Or maybe placing a book you want to read on your bedside table instead of your phone.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Even small changes like that can have a big impact on your habits over time.
Okay.
And speaking of making things easier, one strategy that really stands out is the 2-minute rule.
The 2-minute rule.
Yeah, have you heard of that one?
I don't think so.
This one's a game changer.
Okay.
It's all about reducing the initial barrier to entry.
Okay.
Instead of feeling overwhelmed by a large task, you commit to just 2 minutes of action.
Oh, that makes sense.
Think about starting a writing habit.
Okay.
Instead of pressuring yourself to write a whole chapter, what if you simply committed to opening your notebook and writing for 2 minutes each day?
Yeah, I could see how that would help.
The logic here is that by making the initial step ridiculously easy,
Yeah.
you overcome that inertia, that resistance to getting started.
And often once you've taken that first step, you find yourself naturally wanting to continue.
Okay,
It becomes less about forcing yourself and more about building momentum.
that's interesting.
It's about those decisive moments, those forks in the road where you choose between taking action or staying stuck in your old patterns.
Okay.
By focusing on the first 2 minutes of a habit, you're essentially setting yourself up for success.
Makes sense.
This connects back to the power of systems.
Okay.
By incorporating the 2-minute rule into your daily routines, you're building a system that makes it easier to build positive habits and break free from negative ones.
Right.
What's a 2-minute version of a habit you'd like to build?
I don't know,
Could you meditate for 2 minutes each morning?
I guess.
Do a quick stretch routine?
Yeah, maybe.
The key is to make it so easy that you can't help but start.
Yeah.
And once you've started, you're already on the path to building a new positive habit.
Okay, I like that. So we've talked about making habits obvious and easy, but there's another key ingredient to making them stick, making them attractive.
So we're talking about tapping into our brain's reward system.
Exactly.
I'm intrigued.
Our brains release dopamine not only when we experience pleasure, but also when we anticipate it.
Oh,
This anticipation motivates us to act.
I see.
Think about scrolling through social media.
Oh, yeah.
It's the promise of a potential dopamine, hit a funny meme, a like on your post, that keeps us engaged.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So how do we leverage this for good habits?
Yeah, how do we do that?
One strategy Atomic Habits suggests is temptation bundling,
Temptation bundling.
which is essentially pairing an action you want to do with an action you need to do.
Okay, so like what would that look like?
For example, if you love listening to podcasts, try reserving your favorite one for listening only during workouts.
Oh, that's a good idea.
That way you're associating something you enjoy with something you need to do, making exercise more appealing.
Right, because I always want to listen to that podcast.
Precisely.
So I'll work out.
It's about making the experience more immediately satisfying, which increases the likelihood of repeating it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Atomic Habits also highlights the power of social influence.
Oh,
We are inherently social beings, and we tend to imitate the habits of those around us, especially those we admire or aspire to be like.
it's like that saying, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Exactly.
We subconsciously adopt the habits and behaviors of our close circle.
Clear calls this the influence of the close, the many and the powerful.
Wow.
Think about your own social circles.
Okay.
Are you surrounded by people who support the habits you're trying to build?
That's a good question.
It might be time to seek out groups or communities where your desired habits are the norm.
Yeah, like running clubs or something.
Exactly.
That's a good idea.
If you want to read more, joining a book club can provide that social reinforcement and accountability.
Makes sense.
Now let's move on to the third law of behavior change,
Okay.
making it easy.
Right.
Atomic Habits emphasizes the importance of reducing friction and making good habits as effortless as possible.
So this aligns with what we discussed earlier about the 2-minute rule,
Yeah,
making that initial step so easy that it's almost impossible to resist.
precisely.
Okay.
It's about removing any barriers that stand in the way of taking action.
Right.
We naturally gravitate towards the path of least resistance.
Uh-huh.
Think about it like a garden hose with a kink in it.
Okay.
The water flow is restricted.
Yeah.
Our habits can be blocked by similar kinks,
Oh,
points of friction in our environment or routines.
that's a great analogy.
It could be anything from a cluttered workspace to having to drive across town to get to the gym.
Yeah, that makes sense.
By removing these kinks, we make it easier for good habits to flow.
Okay.
One way to do this is through habit stacking.
Habit stacking.
It's about linking a new habit to an existing one.
I see.
For instance, you could create a habit stack like this. After I pour my morning coffee, I will meditate for 2 minutes.
That's so simple.
You're leveraging an existing routine to trigger a new behavior.
I like.
Now, alongside making habits easy, we also need to make them satisfying.
Okay.
This ties into our brain's preference for immediate rewards over delayed gratification.
Ooh, I am very guilty of that.
One effective method is tracking your progress.
Okay, how do you do that?
Clear suggests using visual measurements, like a habit tracker or a calendar, where you mark off each day you successfully complete the habit.
I've tried habit trackers before, and I find them incredibly motivating.
Yeah.
It's satisfying to see that chain of successes grow,
Yeah.
and it helps me stay accountable.
There's also the paperclip strategy.
What's that?
You have 2 jars, one empty and one filled with paper clips.
Okay.
Each time you complete the habit, you move a paper clip from the full jar to the empty jar.
I love that.
It's such a simple yet visual way to track progress and experience those small wins.
Yeah.
But what about those times when even those small wins don't feel rewarding enough?
Yeah.
Like when you're trying to break a bad habit and the alternative just doesn't seem as appealing? That's where the power of identity comes into play.
Okay.
Atomic Habits suggests that our habits shape our identity,
Uh-huh.
and our identity shapes our habits.
So it's not just about the behavior itself, but what that behavior says about us.
If you see yourself as a healthy person,
Yeah.
you're more likely to make choices that align with that identity, like choosing a salad over fries.
Right.
It's like our habits become votes for the type of person we want to be.
That's a good way to put it.
But how do we make that shift in identity?
Yeah.
It seems like a much deeper change than simply starting a new habit.
Right.
It starts with becoming aware of the stories we tell ourselves.
Okay.
What identity are your current habits reinforcing? Is that the identity you want to embrace?
That's deep.
It's a powerful question to consider.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not about forcing a complete personality change, but rather about aligning our habits with the person we truly want to become.
That makes sense.
Precisely. And Atomic Habits suggests that joining a tribe where your desired behavior is the norm can be incredibly helpful.
Okay.
We tend to adopt the habits of our community, especially when we feel a sense of belonging.
This makes me think about running clubs or book clubs again.
Yeah.
You're surrounded by people who share your interests and support your efforts, making it easier to stick with those habits.
It's about creating an environment where your desired behavior feels natural and rewarding, not forced or out of place.
Okay.
Now, as we delve deeper into Atomic Habits, there's one final concept that I find particularly fascinating: the Goldilocks zone of motivation.
The Goldilocks zone.
It's the idea that we experience peak motivation when we're working on tasks that are just challenging enough, not too easy, not too hard.
That makes sense.
If something's too easy, we get bored.
Right.
If it's too hard, we get discouraged.
Yeah.
But what about those times when even a challenging task starts to feel mundane?
Yeah.
How do we maintain that motivation over the long haul?
That's a good question.
That's where the art of habit cultivation comes in.
Huh?
It's about finding ways to keep those habits engaging,
Uh-huh.
to continually challenge ourselves without becoming overwhelmed.
Yeah. So it's about finding that sweet spot where we're stretching ourselves just enough to stay motivated and engaged. Atomic Habits really dives into the psychology behind this, and I think it's a valuable insight for anyone trying to build lasting habits.
Absolutely. And this leads us back to that fourth law of behavior change,
Yeah.
making it satisfying. We touched on this earlier with habit tracking and the importance of experiencing those small wins along the way.
Right, because our brains are wired for immediate gratification. It's hard to resist that donut when the reward is right there in front of you. But what about when the payoff for a good habit is months or even years down the road? How do we bridge that gap?
One strategy Clear highlights is the idea of using reinforcement.
Hmm.
He talks about how slot machines are so addictive because they offer intermittent rewards.
Mm-hmm.
You don't win every time, but the possibility of winning keeps you pulling that lever.
So how do we apply that to, say, building a habit of saving money? The reward of financial security is way off in the future. It's not like a slot machine where you get that immediate feedback.
It's about finding ways to make the act of saving rewarding in the present moment. Maybe you create a visual representation of your savings goal, like a thermometer that you fill in as you reach certain milestones. Or you could set up a system where you transfer a small amount of money to a fund each time you hit a savings target.
That's a great idea. It's like giving yourself a mini reward along the way, which reinforces the positive behavior. It's about making those small wins tangible and celebrating those milestones.
Exactly. And this ties back to the importance of identity that we talked about earlier. If you see yourself as a financially responsible person, the act of saving becomes intrinsically rewarding, regardless of the long-term payoff.
It's about aligning your actions with your values and your vision for the future. And speaking of vision, you mentioned earlier wanting to find that Goldilocks zone of motivation, that perfect balance between challenge and enjoyment.
Yes. Atomic Habits suggest that peak motivation occurs when we're working on tasks that are right on the edge of our current abilities. If it's too easy, we get bored. If it's too hard, we get discouraged.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where we're stretching ourselves but not overwhelming ourselves. It's like the difference between running a marathon and going for a leisurely walk. Both have their benefits, but that intense challenge of the marathon can be incredibly motivating.
Cloutier shares an anecdote about an elite athletic coach who emphasized the importance of handling the boredom of training. Mastery often involves repetition, which can feel mundane at times.
I can relate to that. It's easy to lose motivation when those initial gains start to plateau and the habit feels less exciting.
That's why it's crucial to find ways to keep those habits engaging, to continually challenge ourselves without becoming overwhelmed. Maybe you set new goals, track your progress in a more motivating way, or even experiment with different variations of the habit to keep things fresh.
It's like adding spices to a familiar recipe. The core ingredients are still there, but those small variations keep things interesting. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into atomic habits, what are some key takeaways that you think could help our listeners create lasting change in their own lives?
For me, it's the emphasis on building systems rather than relying on willpower. It's about making those small, consistent improvements and understanding the science behind habit formation. And it's about finding that Goldilocks zone of motivation where we're challenging ourselves just enough to stay engaged and excited about the process.
Those are all great points. And I think what resonated most with me is the idea that our habits shape our identity and our identity shapes our habits. It's a powerful reminder that lasting change often starts with an internal shift, a belief in who we are and who we can become.
Absolutely. We're not just our actions, we are the sum of our habits. And by understanding how to build better habits, we can ultimately shape a better version of ourselves.
We've only scratched the surface of atomic habits in this deep dive, but I think we've uncovered some valuable strategies that you can start applying today if you're interested in exploring these ideas further. I highly recommend checking out the book itself. It's a fascinating and practical guide to mastering the art of habit formation.
Until next time, remember small changes consistently applied can lead to remarkable results. Keep diving deep and keep building those atomic habits.